Story 1. Story 1, The Blight. The air, usually thick with the sweet scent of alfalfa, hung heavy with something else that summer. Something metallic, something wrong. It clung to the back of my throat, making me gag. My grandfather, a man whose hands were as rough as bark and whose face was etched with the seasons of 70 harvests, didn't seem to notice. He hummed a tuneless melody as he steered the tractor, the rusty behemoth shuddering and groaning beneath us. Almost to the north field, Cassie, he'd said, his voice a low rumble over the engine's roar. Best damn corn I've ever grown. I remember nodding, though my stomach churned. The north field. Bordered by the whispering woods, it had always felt off. Too quiet. Too still. Even the crows avoided it. We spent the next few days harvesting. The corn was indeed magnificent, stalks thicker than my wrist, ears bursting with plump kernels. But the unsettling feeling persisted. It manifested in fleeting glimpses of movement at the edge of the woods, in the unnatural rustle of leaves on windless days, in the way the shadows seemed to stretch and contort themselves. "Grandpa," I said one evening, as we sat on the porch swing, the sun bleeding orange and purple across the horizon. "Do you ever feel watched out in the north field?" He chuckled, a deep, rumbling sound. "Just the crows, Casa girl. They're jealous of my prize-winning corn." But his eyes, I noticed, didn't quite meet mine. The next day, I found a dead rabbit near the edge of the field. Its eyes were milky white, its fur matted and damp. There were no visible wounds, no signs of struggle. It just was. That night, the metallic smell intensified, sharp and acrid, making my eyes water. I woke up sweating, the sheets tangled around my legs, a scream trapped in my throat. Something had brushed against my face, something cold and slick. "Grandpa?" I called out, my voice trembling. Silence. I stumbled out of bed, my heart pounding against my ribs, and went to his room. Empty. Panic clawed at my throat. I grabbed a flashlight and ran outside. The moon, a sliver of silver in the inky sky, cast long, distorted shadows across the yard. The air was thick with the metallic stench, and now, beneath it, something else. Something putrid. The tractor stood silent in the middle of the yard, its headlights casting twin beams of light into the darkness. Beyond it, the north field stretched out like a black abyss. I hesitated, fear paralyzing me. But then, I heard it. A faint, rasping sound, coming from the direction of the field. My grandfather. I forced myself to move, my legs heavy as lead. As I approached the field, the rasping grew louder, punctuated by a low, guttural moan. The flashlight beam danced nervously across the rows of corn, revealing nothing but swaying stalks and shifting shadows. And then, I saw it. A patch of blight. A dark, festering rot spreading across the corn like a malignant stain. The stalks within its grasp were withered and blackened, their leaves curled and brittle. The air around it shimmered with a strange, oily sheen. The rasping stopped. The moaning ceased. The only sound was the whisper of the corn stalks in the wind. I shone the flashlight towards the center of the blight. Something moved within the darkness. Something large. Something hunched. My heart hammered in my chest. I took a tentative step forward. "Grandpa?" I whispered, my voice barely audible above the rustling corn. No response. I took another step. And another. The metallic smell was overwhelming now, choking me. The putrid stench was stronger too, making me gag. And then, I saw him. He was kneeling in the center of the blight, his back to me. His shoulders slumped, his head bowed. He didn't move. "Grandpa?" I called out again, my voice cracking. He slowly turned. The flashlight beam illuminated his face. His eyes were gone. Empty sockets stared back at me, filled with a darkness that seemed to suck the light from the world. His skin was pale and waxy, stretched tight across his bones. And his mouth was stretched into a grotesque, silent scream. He raised a hand, a gnarled, blackened hand, and pointed towards the woods. Towards the whispering darkness that had always filled me with dread. Then, he spoke. His voice was a raspy whisper, barely audible above the rustling corn. "It's hungry." He pointed again, his blackened finger trembling. "It wants more." I backed away, my breath catching in my throat. I turned and ran, stumbling through the rows of corn, the flashlight beam bouncing wildly. I didn't stop running until I reached the farmhouse. I didn't look back. I never went back. The farm was abandoned. The fields left to rot. And the north field remains untouched. A silent testament to the hunger that dwells within the whispering woods. A hunger that, I fear, is still waiting. Waiting for more. Story 2. Story 2, The Blight. Grandma Ilara's farm had always been my sanctuary. Summer spent amidst the rolling hills of Kentucky, the scent of honeysuckle thick in the air, the rhythmic creak of the porch swing, it was a haven from the sterile concrete of my city life. But that summer, the sanctuary warped, festered, and turned against me. It started subtly. The usually vibrant green of the tobacco field seemed duller, almost sickly. A grey, powdery film coated the leaves, which Grandpa Joe, usually a fount of agricultural wisdom, dismissed as just a bit of mildew. But it wasn't just the tobacco. The oak trees lining the long driveway began to shed their leaves prematurely, carpeting the ground with a brittle, rust-colored layer. "Dry spell," Grandpa Joe muttered, his weathered face etched with an unfamiliar worry. The animals, too, were acting strangely. The chickens huddled together in the coop, their usual boisterous clucking replaced by an unsettling silence. Old Blue, the border collie who'd chased me through the fields as a child, now just lay listlessly by the porch, his eyes clouded with a dull apathy. "He's getting on, that's all," Grandma Ilara said, her voice tight. But I could see the fear lurking beneath her forced cheerfulness. One sweltering afternoon, while helping Grandma Ilara shell peas on the porch, I heard it, a low, guttural hum vibrating from the fields. It was a sound that resonated deep within me, a primal thrumming that set my teeth on edge. "Did you hear that, Grandma?" I asked, my voice trembling. She just shook her head, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Just the wind, dear." But the wind wasn't humming. It was growing, spreading, like a creeping infection across the land. That night, the humming intensified. I lay in bed, the stifling heat clinging to my skin, the ominous sound pulsating through the old farmhouse. I tried to tell myself it was just the machinery from a distant farm, but the sound was organic, alive. It wormed its way into my dreams, twisting them into grotesque parodies of rural life, fields of rotting crops, skeletal livestock, and whispers that slithered through the darkness. The next morning, the grey film had spread to the vegetable garden. The tomatoes, once plump and red, were now shriveled and covered in the same powdery blight. Even the sturdy sunflowers, usually reaching towards the sun, drooped their heads in defeat. "We need to call someone," I urged Grandma Ilara, my voice laced with panic. "An agricultural expert, someone who can tell us what's happening." She just stared at the blighted garden, a haunted look in her eyes. "No one can help us, dear. It's been here too long." Her words chilled me to the bone. What had she meant by too long? How long had this blight, been festering on their farm? The humming grew louder, more insistent. It was now accompanied by a faint, sickly sweet odor, like rotting fruit mixed with something else. Something alien. I felt a constant prickling sensation on my skin, as if unseen insects were crawling all over me. The air grew heavy, oppressive, making it difficult to breathe. Grandpa Joe, once a robust man, became gaunt and withdrawn. He spent his days staring out at the blighted fields, muttering incomprehensible words under his breath. Grandma Ilara, too, seemed to be succumbing to the insidious decay that was consuming their farm. Her once warm smile was replaced by a vacant stare, her movement slow and deliberate, as if controlled by an unseen force. One night, I woke to find Grandpa Joe standing over my bed, his eyes wide and unseeing. He reached out a trembling hand towards me, his lips moving, but no sound came out. Then, as quickly as he'd appeared, he turned and shuffled out of the room. I followed him, my heart pounding in my chest. He led me to the barn, the humming emanating from within, stronger than ever. The barn door was slightly ajar, and through the crack, I saw a pulsating, otherworldly glow. "Grandpa, what is that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible above the humming. He didn't answer. He just pushed the door open and stepped inside. The humming intensified, drowning out all other sounds. The sickly sweet odor became overwhelming, choking me. I hesitated, fear gripping me like a vice. But I couldn't leave him in there alone. I took a deep breath and stepped into the barn. The glow was coming from the center of the barn floor. It pulsated rhythmically, casting grotesque shadows on the walls. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I saw Grandpa Joe standing before the glowing mass, his back to me. I took a step closer, and a wave of nausea washed over me. The glowing mass was moving. It was a pulsating mound of something. Something organic, yet utterly alien. It writhed and throbbed, emitting the low, guttural hum that had been haunting me for weeks. Then, Grandpa Joe turned around. His eyes, once filled with warmth and life, were now vacant, black pits. His skin was pale and stretched taut across his bones. He reached out to me, a grotesque parody of a smile twisting his lips. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" he whispered, his voice hollow and unnatural. I stumbled back, horror gripping me. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs felt like lead. The pulsating mass began to expand, reaching out towards me with tendrils of something. Something slimy and pulsating. The sickly sweet odor intensified, filling my lungs, choking me. I turned and ran, blindly, desperately, back towards the house. I didn't look back. I never saw Grandpa Joe or Grandma Ilara again. I fled the farm, leaving behind the humming, the blight, the horror. But the humming follows me. I hear it in the silence of the night, in the rustling of leaves, in the murmur of the wind. And sometimes, in my dreams, I see the pulsating mass, reaching out, waiting. And I know, with a chilling certainty, that the blight is spreading. Story 3. Story 3, The Blight. Grandma Ilara's farm had always been my sanctuary. Rolling hills blanketed in emerald green, the sweet tang of freshly cut hay, and the lullaby of cicadas, it was an escape from the concrete jungle I called home. But that summer, the sanctuary became a tomb. "Sarah, darling, could you fetch me some water from the well?" Grandma Ilara's voice, usually vibrant, now held a tremor. She looked frail, smaller than I remembered, swallowed by her oversized floral armchair. "Of course, Grandma." The well was old, a brick cylinder tucked away in the furthest corner of the property, shaded by a gnarled oak. Its wooden crank groaned a mournful tune as I hauled up the bucket. The water, usually crystal clear, was murky, tinged with a sickly yellow. A putrid smell, like rotting meat left in the sun, wafted from its depths. I wrinkled my nose, dismissing it as a dead animal. That night, the unsettling feeling began. It started with an itch, a deep, bone-deep itch that spread across my arms and legs. I scratched until my skin was raw, but the itch remained, relentless. Later, I heard a rustling in the attic, like something large shifting through the dusty boxes and forgotten furniture. When I mentioned it to Grandma Ilara, she just smiled wanly and said, "Just the wind, dear." But the wind didn't explain the low, guttural moans echoing from the fields at night. Nor did it explain the strange, pulsating growths that began appearing on the livestock. Small, fleshy lumps at first, they quickly swelled, transforming into grotesque, bulbous masses that oozed a thick, yellow fluid, identical in color to the tainted well water. "Grandma, the cows, they're sick." "Really sick," I said, my voice shaking. Her eyes, once bright and full of life, were now dull, clouded over with a strange film. "It's just a blight, Sarah. It'll pass." But it didn't pass. It spread. The crops began to wither and rot, replaced by the same pulsating growths that plagued the animals. Even the trees seemed to be infected, their bark bubbling and oozing the viscous yellow fluid. One morning, I woke to find Grandma Ilara gone. Her bed was empty, the sheets cold. Panic clawed at my throat. I searched the house, the barn, the fields, calling her name until my voice was hoarse. Then, I saw it. Near the well, a patch of earth was freshly turned. A single, gnarled hand, identical to Grandma Ilara's, protruded from the loose soil. But the skin, it was smooth, taut, and unnaturally pale. The fingernails had grown, thick and yellowed, resembling the grotesque growths on the livestock. My stomach lurched. I dug frantically, unearthing not my grandmother, but a thing. It vaguely resembled her, but its skin was stretched tight over its bones, revealing the pulsing, yellow growths that now covered its body. Its eyes, wide and vacant, stared up at the sky. From its mouth, a single, thick yellow root snaked out, disappearing into the earth. That night, the itching intensified, spreading to my face and scalp. I caught a glimpse of my reflection in a cracked window pane. My skin, once smooth, was now dotted with small, fleshy bumps. The same yellow growths. I ran. I ran through the blighted fields, away from the farmhouse, away from the well, away from the thing that had once been my grandmother. I didn't look back. I found my way to the nearest town, collapsing on the doorstep of a small diner. The waitress, a kind-faced woman with worried eyes, helped me inside, offered me water, and called a doctor. The doctor examined me, his brow furrowed in confusion. He couldn't explain the growths, the itching, the rapid deterioration of my health. He ran tests, took samples, but everything came back normal. He suggested stress, prescribed some medication, and sent me home. But the itching remains. The growths are still there, slowly spreading, pulsating beneath my skin. And in my dreams, I see the well, the gnarled oak, and the thing that was once my grandmother, beckoning me back to the farm, back to the blight. And sometimes, when I'm alone, I swear I can hear the faint, mournful groan of the well's crank, calling me home. Calling me back to the earth. Calling me back to the blight.